Holding started. Zoom in button. Zoom out button.
Well, good morning, dear students. Once again, we are together, and we would continue with our interpretation of Coleridge's Kubla Khan. Now, just a minute. You see this. Uh, the last point that we discussed was that a powerful fountain was unnaturally created from the chasm, and it was bubbling with ceaseless, unending turmoil, that is noise, and its noise was quite comparable to the snows of the earth. It seemed as if the earth was snoring, as if the earth was breathing in fast, thick pants. That is the loud, um, uh, you know, strong noise, loud, quick noise of breathing. So, this mighty fountain, as I told you, is something holy because it is the source of the sacred river Elf, and the river, the waters of the river, which comes from the fountain, makes the whole landscape fertile. So that is why this romantic chasm is called holy. Remember, it's also called romantic. That's because it inspires the feeling of awe, wonder, and mystery. It's called savage and enchanted, magical. That's because it is comparable to a place which was which is supposed to be haunted by a woman wailing for her demon lover, looking for her demon lover, sobbing. You know, the, um, the woman is deserted by the demon after he having made love to her. So there are endless suggestions in this romantic chasm. Let's see more of the fountain. Amid whose half intermittent bursts, huge fragments vaulted like rebounding hail or chaffy grain beneath the thresher's flail. Now, in order to make the supernatural element more convincing, Coleridge brings in some realistic imagery. You see, the earlier images like ceaseless turmoil, the earth in fast, thick pants were breathing, a woman wailing for her demon lover, waning moon. These are all, I mean, not all, but some of them, quite a lot of them, like ceaseless turmoil, or especially the earth in fast, thick pants were breathing. These images are subconscious images. They appear to be unreal or unrealistic. Now the images that are coming, they are realistic, and they make the supernatural elements of the poem more convincing, or they serve to highlight the supernatural element in the poem. Now, what happened? The water was gushing out at intervals, half intermitted, as I told you while dictating the meanings, that there was I mean, half intermittent, interrupted by a minute or a second or a very small time. So the gushing of the water was interrupted regularly. So यानी ये जो पानी जो फाउंटेन से आ रहा था वो रुक रुक के आ रहा था, झटके के साथ। पानी मुसलसल फ्लो नहीं कर रहा था, बल्कि ये कहें कि एक एक मिनट पे, आधे आधे मिनट पे या चंद सेकंड्स पे वो रुक के आ रहा था। बट द फ्लो वाज स्विफ्ट, very quick. That's why he has used the word burst. It was not a flow, not the flow of the water, but the burst of water. The water was bursting forth. And the burst was so powerful that huge parts of rocks, huge fragments of rocks were flown, and they fell on the ground, and after their impact with the ground, after falling on the ground, they bounced back. यानी जमीन से टकराने के बाद वो फिर ऊपर उछल जाते थे. Now these fragments of rocks are compared to two things. One, rebounding hail beneath the thresher's flail. So not two things, sorry, one thing only. So these fragments of rocks were bouncing back like the hail. Yes, two things. The hailstones you may have seen, बर्फबारी जो होती है, जैसे कि बर्फ के ओला जिसे बोलते हैं, जब वो ज़मीन पे गिरता है, टकराता है, तो उछल के फिर ऊपर जाता है. So this is one comparison, rebounding hail. The other comparison is the rocks are compared to chaffy grain beneath the thresher's flail. Once, as I told you, thresher is the person who used to thresh, that is, separate grain from the chaff, that is the cover or the husk. Flail is the stick. So he used to beat the heap of grain with his stick. अनाज के ढेर पे वो स्टिक मारता था, तो उससे अनाज के दाने उछल के ऊपर जाते थे, ज़मीन से टकराते थे और फिर उछल के ऊपर जाके नीचे गिर जाते थे. इससे ये होता था कि वो जो उसका जो हस्क था, शैफ जिसे बोलते हैं, तो वो रिमूव हो जाता था. पहले ये तरीका हुआ करता था. So the huge fragments rather of rocks vaulted, leapt, jumped, bounced back. Like what? Like the rebounding hail or the chaffy grain beneath the thresher's flail. So these two metaphors, rebounding hail and chaffy grain beneath the thresher's flail, these are realistic images found in everyday life, and they convince us. Convinced with what? With the supernatural element. Like, this whole romantic chasm, is described as a kind of a supernatural place, savage, enchanted, holy, and all of a sudden a mountain being created, and a lot of noise and turmoil and disturbance, and then, the powerful burst of the fountain, throwing huge pieces of rocks which seem to be bouncing back like the rebounding hail or chaffy grain. So these huge pieces of rocks were, in a way, as small a thing as a hailstone or a chaffy grain in comparison to the force of the water. इससे आप पानी की फोर्स का अंदाज़ा लगाइए कि कितनी ताकत से पानी बर्स्ट कर रहा था, कि बड़ी बड़ी जो टुकड़े थे चट्टानों के, वो भी ज़मीन पे ऐसे गिर रहे थे जैसे कि लग रहा हो कि अनाज के दाने उछल रहे हो. या hailstones uchal rahe ho. So you see, imagine the strength or the force of the power, the power of the strength of the burst of water. So it gives us an idea of that. So the fountain, as I told you, was something holy. Now see, and mid these dancing rocks at once and ever, it flung up momently the sacred river. So mid these dancing rocks, so now these same fragments of rocks, which were earlier compared to the hailstones or chaffy grain, they are now called dancing rocks. They seem to be dancing, and the phrase at once and ever suggests a pattern. There was a pattern. मतलब एक तरह का सिलसिला बन गया था कि एक फॉर एग्जांपल एक फ्रैगमेंट आया, फिर दूसरा आया, फिर तीसरा आया, तो एक कंटिन्यूटी बन गई थी. So mid these dancing rocks, what happened? The fountain flung up momently the sacred river. That is, every moment it gave birth to the river which was sacred. 5 miles meandering with a mazy motion through wood and dale, the sacred river ran. So as I told you, for 5 miles the river ran over ground. It passed through woods and dales, valleys, and its motion was meandering. That is, it was having a winding course. Now, meandering and mazy. Mazy means confusing, winding. Both words have same meaning, and both words describe the movement of the water. Earlier, we came across, um, rills. Let's see what word is used for rills. Um, Sinuous rills, yes. Sinuous was the word which was used earlier, and now we have meandering and mazy. So these words describe the movement of the water. Then what happened? Then reached the caverns measureless to man, and sank in tumult to a lifeless ocean. So after covering this distance of 5 miles, then what happened? The river finally reached the caverns measureless to man, large caves which were immeasurably deep, and then flowed underground for about 5 miles, and finally it sank into a sunless sea, that is a dark subterranean sea. And in what way did it sink? It is also noticeable. It sank with a tumult, with a loud noise. Notice that the water of the fountain flows or gushes out or bursts forth with ceaseless turmoil. So it begins with a lot of turmoil and noise, and it ends with a lot of turmoil, with a lot of noise. Now see, and mid this tumult Kubla heard from far and ancestral voices prophesying war, the shadow of the doom of pleasure floated midway on the waves, where was heard the mingled measure from the fountain and the caves. It was a miracle of a rare device, a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. These are the closing lines of part 1. Now what happened? The pleasure dome was situated exactly in the center of the landscape, and at this point, as I told you, the pleasure dome and the sacred river meet. The shadow of the pleasure dome fell midway in the middle of the river, fell midway on the waves of the river. So this shows that the landscape was situated in the middle, and Kubla Khan in the middle was, mid this tumult, mid this noise, Kubla Khan was able to hear the mingled measure. The measure here means sound, the mixed sound of what? From the fountain, that is the sound of the creation of the river, and the caves, that is, you remember when the river started from the fountain, the fountain water gushed with a lot of noise, and there was again a noise when this river ultimately fell into a sunless sea. There was again a noise.
Service updating.
So Kubla Khan was able to
27
hear
degrees side neighbor. High 30 degrees, low 25 degrees.
Kubla Khan in the middle was able to hear both noises. That is the noise of the beginning of the river, or rather, the gushing of the water from the fountain, which was the beginning of the river, and the sounds of the river falling into the sunless sea. Now, here he heard these two sounds, and at the same time, what else he heard? Ancestral voices, voices of his ancestors. This is again a supernatural element. Prophesying war, they were predicting war and urging him to prepare for it. Well, firstly, these sounds may be these voices may be the voices of Kubla's ancestor or the ancestors of his priests. You see, at the time of Kubla Khan, Tartars used to live in China. Tartars, 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 जिन्हें हम उर्दू में तातारी भी कहते हैं. Those who are students of history would be familiar with it. So amongst the Tartars, there was a belief to consult the priests before a war. So these voices may be the voices of Kubla Khan's ancestors, or the ancestors of the priests of Kubla Khan. Anyway, it was for your information. The important thing is that Kubla Khan heard voices urging him to prepare for a war. Now, this is something very common in an emperor's life. This used to be a common factor. जो पहले जो यानी जिस तरह की हुकूमतें हुआ करती थीं, जैसे कि किंग्स होते थे, तो कभी तो उनकी किंगडम में पीस होता था, कभी कोई बराबर से उनके ऊपर अटैक करके वॉर की सिचुएशन हो जाती थी. तो पीस और वॉर दोनों ही रहते थे. बोथ सिंबलाइज the positive and the negative aspects, the comfortable and the horrible aspects of life. So, you see this landscape, we can't say it resembles heaven, no, because there is no resemblance of heaven on earth. अब जन्नत नज़ीर जिसे बोलते हैं, जन्नत नज़ीर तो जन्नत की कोई हो ही नहीं सकती, एग्जाम्पल तो कोई हो ही नहीं सकती, क्योंकि जन्नत जो है, heaven is beyond human perception. But still, it gives us a feeling as if it was a kind of a heaven in which Kubla Khan was living. क्योंकि जिस तरह का लैंडस्केप डिस्क्राइब किया गया है, जैसा काज़्म है, जैसा फाउंटेन है, जैसी रिवर है, केव्स है, सारी पूरी जो ज्योग्राफी है इसकी, that gives us an idea of a heaven. लेकिन it's not a heaven. Here there is turmoil also, tumult also, fear of war as well. So it combines both elements, the negative and the positive. And in this sense, it may stand for the general human life, which is full of both negative and positive aspects. दोनों ही तरह के aspects का भी symbol हो सकता है. तो लेकिन जो भी हो, हमारी अपनी लाइफ भी और ये लैंडस्केप भी, ये एक तरह का सिंबल है फ्यूजन ऑफ सेक्रेडनेस एंड प्लेजर, या फ्यूजन ऑफ प्लेजर एंड सेक्रेडनेस, जैसा कि इस लैंडस्केप में भी है और ऐसा ही हमारी एवरीडे लाइफ में भी है. और there are disturbing elements also like turmoil, tumult, professing war तो वॉर को हम वॉर की सेंस में अगर ना लें तो प्रॉब्लम्स के सेंस में ले सकते हैं. तो ये पैटर्न लाइफ का भी यही पैटर्न है, कंफर्ट भी है और डिसकंफर्ट भी है. लैंडस्केप जो है वो अपने आप में फुल है प्लेजर से और सेक्रेडनेस से भी, और इसमें एम्परर के लिए थ्रेट्स भी हैं. तो ऐसा नहीं है कि कोई ये फूल प्रूफ जगह हो जहाँ कोई प्रॉब्लम्स ना हो. सो एनीवे, this combines sacredness and pleasure. Now the poet concludes this part by saying it was a miracle of rare device, a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. So in a way it was a wonder. It was a wonderful thing, the pleasure dome. The dome was sunny. At the top you could experience sun, but at the bottom, that is um, at the bottom of the palace, not exactly at the bottom, but beneath the palace, there were caves of ice. So ice beneath, sun above. In between, you've got the pleasure dome. So it was a wonderful thing. It was an example of rare human skill, the way it was built. So this is part one. Now see the precision in part one. I briefly summarize. In the center, we have the pleasure dome. To one side of the pleasure dome, we have the fountain, which is the source of the river. To the other side, we have the caverns, measureless to man, in which the river disappears and falls into a sunless sea. And in the middle, both the pleasure dome and the river meet. And pleasure dome, as we know, is a symbol of satisfaction, fulfillment, especially in poetic ecstasy. And the river is a symbol of sacredness. So the point where the two meet symbolize the conjunction of sacredness and pleasure, the fusion of sacredness and pleasure. And then, it's full of positive and negative aspects. There are dream images like earth in fast thick pants were breathing, ceaseless turmoil, negative and positive images like ceaseless turmoil, tumult, then we have rebounding hail, chaffy grain. These are harmless, positive images. So there is the romantic chasm with endless suggestions, that is romantic as well as savage and holy and enchanted. There is the image of a woman wailing for her demon lover, and then the imagery in the beginning, that of forests, gardens, bright spots. These are positive images. So positive and negative images are put together, realistic and unrealistic images are put together to give an impression of surrealism. Now part 2 shows what happens to the poet who is able to realize this fusion of sacredness and pleasure, the kind of situation, the kind of experience that he undergoes. So we start part 2. A damsel with a dulcimer, in a vision once I saw, it was an Abyssinian maid, and on her dulcimer she played, singing of Mount Abora. So once in a vision, in his imagination, the poet saw a beautiful girl playing on her dulcimer, a musical instrument. It was an Abyssinian maid, a girl from Abyssinia. the African country, and she was singing of the glory of Mount Abora. Now, once again, just as the beginning of part 1 has Xanadu and Elf, which combine the real and the unreal, so similarly here too we have real and unreal. Abyssinia is a real place, and Mount Abora is an imaginary mountain. So once again mixing real and unreal. So in his vision, the poet once uh, saw the girl and listened to the music, the great music. It's great because it's an analogy of the landscape. That is, it too symbolizes the fusion of sacredness and pleasure. Um, the girl was singing of the glory of Mount Abora, and so that is something grand, you know. And at the same time, there was pleasure in it. Now see, could I revive within me her symphony and song? To such a deep delight it would win me that with, that with music loud and long I would build that doom in air, that sunny doom, those caves of ice. So the poet says that if he is able to recreate, if somehow he is able to relive, re-experience that music in his imagination, and music includes what? Both symphony, that is the orchestral composition, as well as the song. Then what would happen? It would give him a deep delight. Remember, delight, delight. So poetic creation gives one a happiness, an extreme joy, an ecstasy. It would make him ecstatic, and it would give him that sublime pleasure. Because remember, it would not be pleasure only, it would be a mix of pleasure and sacredness. It would be a refined pleasure. So that ecstasy, with the help of that ecstasy, what would he do? He says that with music loud and long, look at the two long vowel sound, loud and long. So with the help of that music, or in other words, it would be fair to say that with the help of the effect that that music creates, or the ecstasy that that music creates, with the help of that, he would be able to build that dome in air. That same dome which is described in part 1, he'll be able to build it in air in imagination, or recreate it in his poetry. You know, that is why we say part 1 and part 2 are connected. The word doom occurs in part 1 as well and part 2 as well. So he would experience both aspects of life, that of pleasure and sacredness, the positive and negative. He would experience life in totality, not in parts as we do. One moment we are happy, the other moment we are not. So that's not the case with the poet. The poet would experience life as a whole, positive and negative, and in this way he would experience the fusion of sacredness and pleasure, and this would help give him a kind of an ecstasy which would help him to recreate great poetry. Look, he says that sunny dome, those caves of ice, yes, he will recreate it in his poetry, and all those who heard should see them there. That is, those who would hear his poetry, they would be able to visualize the dome, the ice, the caves of ice, and the sunny dome. यानी वो डिस्क्रिप्शन इतना ग्राफिक होगा, इतना क्लियर होगा कि उसको सुनने वाले उन चीज़ों को अपने इमेजिनेशन में देख सकेंगे. बिल्कुल जैसे ये कहते हैं ना कि he would draw a picture in words, a picture in words, pictorial quality उसमें ऐसी होगी. They'll be able to visualize. So, he would create great poetry thus, and all who um, sorry, and all should cry, beware, beware. His flashing eyes, his floating hair, weave a circle round him thrice, and close your eyes with holy dread. For he on honeydew hath fed, and drunk the milk of paradise. Now see, those who see, those who hear the poetry, they would cry, they would shout what? Beware, beware, weave a circle round him thrice. देखिए ये बात है, जैसा मैंने आपको शुरू में बताया था, इसको समझ लें कि पोएट में सुपर ह्यूमन पावर्स आ जाएंगे. जब सुपर ह्यूमन पावर्स आ जाते हैं तो उसके इफ़ेक्ट्स होते हैं आम लोगों पे, और उन इफ़ेक्ट से उन्हें नुकसान भी पहुंच सकता है. If a person has superhuman powers and if he looks at the common man with that power in the say state of ecstasy, if he looks at others, then they might be harmed. But there is nothing negative about it, nothing magical about it. एक तरह का मैजिक है ये, मगर मैजिकल कुछ नहीं है इसमें, ये होलीनेस है. जैसे कि सूफिया को वज्द आ जाता था जब वो झूमने लगते थे, यानी अपने क्रिएटर के बारे में सोच के या कव्वाली सुनते हुए जो भी उन पे कैफियत तारी होती थी, जो कैफियत बनती थी, वो झूमने लगते थे. उन्हें ये अंदाज़ा नहीं होता था कि वो कहाँ हैं और उनके साथ क्या हो रहा है. तो उस कंडीशन में उनकी नज़र जिधर पड़ जाती थी तो एक बिजली सी कड़कती थी, और उसको नुकसान भी हो सकता था एक आम आदमी को, क्योंकि आम आदमी में वो होलीनेस नहीं है, वो पावर नहीं है, तो वो उस पावर्स को रिसीव नहीं कर सकता. So the poet becomes a superhuman, and his powers are superhuman powers, and the ordinary people who are hearing to his poetry, they are not capable of receiving those superhuman powers. They cannot bear to look at the poet. His superhuman powers may have an adverse effect on them. That is why they say that weave a circle round him thrice. तो पुराने वक्तों में एक ये बिलीफ था कि किसी के मैजिक से अगर बचना है तो उसके गिर्द गोलाई में 3 बार घूम ले, तो फिर उसके मैजिक से बच जाएंगे. एक हिसार सा हो जाता है, एक रेखा खिंच जाती है. सो दैट इज़ वाई दे वुड क्राई दैट they should weave a circle round him thrice so that they can escape from the effects of superhuman power, because he is blessed now with superhuman powers. And look, these two phrases, his flashing eyes, his floating hair, the flash in the eyes is symbolic of superhuman power, and his floating hair, you remember the glittering eyes of the ancient mariner, which could stop a person until he hears the whole story of the ancient mariner. Ancient mariner में ऐसा ही होता है कि mariner को वो spiritual powers मिल जाते हैं, वो superhuman powers मिल जाते हैं कि वो जिसकी तरफ देख लेता था तो वो वहाँ से हिल नहीं सकता था जब तक उसकी पूरी स्टोरी न सुन ले. So it is that kind of power, he is blessed with that power. Now obviously, to escape the effects of that power, they call, or rather ask each other to weave a circle round him thrice. And what's the reason that they give? For he on honeydew hath fed, and drunk the milk of paradise. Why? Because he has fed on the honeydew. Honeydew, I told you, was believed to be a kind of a dew falling from the heaven, which gives one the feel of eternity. And milk of paradise means nectar. Together, honeydew and milk of paradise, these two images suggest heavenly food. That is, he has fed on heavenly food. अब ये वो फूड नहीं है जो हम सुबह शाम खाते हैं, वो फूड से मतलब वो नहीं है, बल्कि it refers to the divine inspiration. He is divinely inspired, and he has a feel of eternity. देखिए, because he is supposed to have drunk the milk of paradise, so हम ये मानते हैं पैराडाइज में जो भी होगा वो इटर्नल होगा, वहाँ किसी को मौत नहीं आएगी, इटर्निटी होगी. So he has experienced eternity. He has been blessed with superhuman powers. He is blessed with extraordinary creativity now. He would create great poetry, and in a way he has created great poetry. Great poetry की एग्जांपल आपको फर्स्ट पार्ट में मिल जाएगी. वो ग्रेट पोइट्री है. जिस तरह से लैंडस्केप डिस्क्राइब किया गया है आप उसे विजुअलाइज कर सकते हैं. So you see, the poet who is divinely inspired is capable of creating great poetry. And you know, this uh, this also suggests that the poet has got the paradisaic pleasure or the heavenly pleasure. This ecstasy is not an ordinary ecstasy, rather it is something heavenly. क्योंकि उसने नेक्टर को एक तरह से एक्सपीरियंस किया है. नेक्टर तो हमें अमर बना देता है ना, तो अमर होने का उसे एक्सपीरियंस हुआ है इस जन्म में, इस ज़िंदगी में ही, डिवाइन इंस्पिरेशन की वजह से. और इससे ग्रेट पोइट्री क्रिएट होती है. इससे मतलब ये नहीं है कि एग्जैक्टली वो ऐसा ही अमर हो गया जैसे कि सब अमर हो जाते हैं, अब उसे मौत नहीं आएगी. नहीं, मौत आएगी, लेकिन वो एक लम्हे के लिए या उस पीरियड के लिए जिस टाइम पे वो क्रिएट कर रहा है, जब तक वो एक्सटेटिक कंडीशन बाकी है, यू नो, ड्यूरिंग दैट टाइम ही हैज़ अ फील ऑफ इटर्निटी. So this is the whole poem then. Now in the next part we will take up questions. So goodbye for now.
Stop button.